My name is Bob Tickleman. I'm a Principal Microsoft Technical Trainer. I'm excited to be your guide for Module number 2, Develop Azure Functions, part of the Azure Functions learning path in the AZ-204 course. In a previous recording, we've talked about where the Azure Function fits from an overall application design, and we talked about its position as opposed to the other types of applications that you might take a look at in your micro or monolithic application development. They become these small bits of code or helper pieces within your application development, and depending on the plan that you use to deploy them, are very cost-effective, cost performance-wise, benefit tool that you can now use to scale your application and have these small functions assist the larger application development that you're working with. What we're going to take a look at in this module is the function itself and how the structure of the files and the code that you're going to be deploying into the Azure Function app that you're going to be building. We're going to take a look at some of the features of the connections of the function to the services you're dealing with. We refer to those as bindings. You had both inbound and outbound bindings. And so this is just taking a look at the plumbing that pulls all these pieces together. So when you take a look at functions, it's going to make it easier to you to pick your favorite coding editor that you can use. Doesn't matter whether you're using VS Code, heck, could even be a notepad, but we don't care what language you're working with. All of them support an Azure Function app development environment. When you take a look at an Azure Function, all it's doing is providing the environment to run the code in which you've written. So that provides the execution, as I said, the compute resources that you're working with, depending on the plan that you've assigned to the Azure Function itself. Now, all of that is going to have a folder structure that you want to put together. Now, I'm going to go out again to Copilot and show you this because I think it does a better job than what the slides are and some of the stuff in the book. But we're going to take a look at the directory structure. They're talking about this hosts.json, local settings.json files. So let's go into Copilot and see what it tells me. Given it a similar input, I've asked Copilot to describe an Azure function and in detail what the folder structure is and the files that makes it up. And so it talks about the root folder. I'm going to come back to this in just a second, and I'm just going to show you what it looks like. And not only did it do it for C#, it's going to do it for a different set of code. So I can see an example structure for JavaScript and an example structure for C#. Again, we don't care what you code in, but you can see that there's a very similar structure, that there's the function. You have your host.json, there's that local settings.json file, same for both. You got your package.json. Now, some of this is going to be different depending on whether it's C#, but you'll see this whole structure. Now, taking a look at the files that make up this structure, the root folder has the host.json file that is the global configuration of the Azure Function host itself. So it's going to have the code, and there's an example of what it is. Your local settings.json provides the local development settings for the connection strings that you're working with. Now, again, depending on how you're deploying this, remember, some of these may come from other areas. We talked about development settings like connection strings and environmental variables in things like app service plans. You could actually manage that through the app service plan to provide these, but it's available in a local settings.json file to provide those connection strings you're working with. I'm not going to get to the git ignore, but then your package.json requirements, depending on the language you're working with, just has the different extensions. And then the actual function folder itself. This is where your function code is going to be. In a previous example, we talked about the LUN algorithm. This is where you'd put in that calculation, taking the input value. Now, I am going to go back to the slides in just a second, and they'll show you this, that this is talking about the authentication level. What type of binding are we working with? In this case, it's an HTTP trigger. That's not only just a binding, it's a triggering binding that is going to initiate this. It's an inbound direction that you're dealing with. And we can also have an HTTP outbound. So remember, we talked about bindings either being inbound and outbound. So here's an example of a binding. It's an inbound binding, but it's also a triggering binding that you're dealing with. Just back in the course material, that is the structure of the folders and files that are going to make up your function itself. Now, you're seeing the exact same thing that I just was showing you, that we're seeing examples of that local settings.json file that is going to give you that general settings for the connection strings that you're working with. We then see the triggering activities. Remember that an Azure function can have one and only one triggering activity, which is going to be an inbound binding, and you define the kind of binding that it's going to be. Then you can have other bindings that you're working with as either inbound or outbound. If you remember, there was a picture that we showed. Maybe I can go back to that one that describes all these different bindings. And so you can connect to either grab information from a notification hub and write things back to an event grid if you wanted to. So an inbound versus an outbound. So all of these red lines you see on here are bindings that you're working with. They can either be an inbound where you're going to pull information from that source, or an outbound which you're going to write information back to that location. And only one of them could be that triggering activity to initiate the actual function. This is just giving you some examples of the triggering bindings. I showed this back to you actually in the Copilot example where it talked about the data type. In this case, it's an HTTP trigger. The name is request. So direction is inbound. And this could be considered a triggering binding if you marked it as the type is a trigger. It's giving you some of the stuff I've already talked about in the function.json. The triggering function is always an inbound trigger, and it could be based on instead a time-based trigger or some kind of event or activity that you're working with. Inputs and outputs can be both inbound and outbound. This is just reiterating a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about. So in addition to the bindings that you're working with, you may need to actually have authentication as well. So to be able to connect to a storage account or be able to write back to a Cosmos DB, your Azure function by itself may not have the necessary criteria. It could potentially, if you're working with things like system assigned managed identities, you can assign it to that system assigned managed identity. Or if you wanted to actually have different identities, you can actually configure that information and store that value into something like Key Vault. So we have our connection strings that you're working with, as well as that identity-based connection to validate the connection either on the inbound or the outbound connection that you're working with. So this is going to get us into an exercise where we're going to walk through. This is following along on some of the labs if you want to go off and perform those. And we'll come back after the lab.
A little bit different than what I did in the demonstrations and the recording. I'm going to actually work on Visual Studio Code on my local project. I'm going to just create a function and do a sample run of it. I'm going to then deploy and execute that function into Azure. Okay, so you can see I'm started off in the Azure portal. I have no resources. Switching back over to my local copy of Visual Studio Code, I'm going to press the F1 key to get the command palette. And I can either scroll through the list to find what I'm looking for. I can start typing in the pieces, but I'm looking for an Azure function, create new project. Type that in. I'll find a folder on my local computer that I want for this. I'll select the options of C#, .NET 8. I'll pick an HTTP trigger. I'm going to change the name to HTTP example, and then provide the namespace for my function. Also anonymous, and open in current window. It's going to open up a terminal window for me. Creating the Azure project. I'm going to select it, trust the code. So I switched from the output pane over to the terminal pane. And depending on how you configured your Visual Studio Code, this could just take a few seconds to a few minutes to download all the necessary files. I'm going to run the function in debugger mode with function F5. Skip this for now. And you notice there in the yellow, the HTTP trigger for the function running locally on my computer. Now, I sped up some of the process to get here. It took a couple of minutes for that to take place on my computer. On the left-hand side, coming into my local project, my Azure function. And you can see my HTTP trigger 1. And I'm going to execute the function now. I'll accept the default. And you can see the response, welcome Azure Function. Again, if I wanted to see that, I can get that in the notification. Shift F5 stops it. And now what I'm going to do is deploy and execute the function in Azure. First, I have to sign into Azure. I'm going to go through, put in my username and password. Once this comes up, and I'll be right back. So I've entered my username and password. It's now asking me to authorize the application. I'm now connected to Azure. I'm going to create a resource. As we did before, we can either scroll down, look for it. We can start typing in what it is that I want to create. So I started typing it in, got create an Azure function. I'll give it a name. Deploy in East US. I'll select .NET 8. We'll wait for this to finish creating, and then I'll go into the Azure portal and show it to you there. Switching back over to the Azure portal, I'll just refresh this, and we should see the resources created. And you now see that I've got a number of resources that have been created. Let's switch back and actually deploy the app now. Remember the key to get into the command palette? This time we're going to search for Azure Functions, deploy to function app. We want to deploy. You can view our output, and you now see the URL endpoint that we can use to get to this. And come back over into my functions, and I can execute function now. Keep the default. And it's run that trigger. You saw the welcome function. That brings the lab to a close. We'll go back to the lecture.
Welcome back from the lab. We're going to wrap up the module doing a traditional knowledge check. So question number 1, what is required for an Azure function to run? A trigger, a binding, or both? You can pause the screen if you want for a second. Now, this is a bit of a tricky question, I think, because you need a trigger to run it. A trigger can be a type of binding, and it's always inbound. But, is it both? So it needs to be a binding that is an inbound that could be identified as a trigger. So, I say that it's a trigger is what you need, but know that a trigger is a binding. So is it both? We can argue that. Question number 2, what supports the in and outbound direction settings? Triggers, bindings, or both? You can pause the screen if you want. So similar to what we just talked about, triggers are bindings, but they're only one direction. They're inbound. So what supports both inbound and outbound? That's just the bindings. They can do inbound or outbound, and you can have multiples, but you can only have one inbound trigger. So we've taken a look at the structure of the Azure functions themselves, not the code, the Azure function feature. We've looked at in previous recordings what an Azure function is and the ways that you can deploy the Azure function using the different consumption plans that are available for you, or the different plans, one of which being a consumption plan. And in this module, we took a look at the infrastructure, the files and the folders that are going to make up the code. You can code in whichever language, whichever IDE that you have, but then you have that folder structure that you then import into the Azure function and then can control the deployment of the actual code itself. We've taken a look at the different types of triggers that we had, as well as the bindings, and saw that hierarchical structure that you can have multiple bindings, both on inbound and outbound. One of those bindings must be a trigger, and that triggering would then be making it an inbound feature for you to be able to initiate the Azure function itself. And remember, there's only one. In the case of a logic app, you could have up to 10, and all these slight differences that we've taken a look at. We saw that there's also values and variables that you can work with this to be able to connect to other sources. We had authentication methods you're working with, so quite a bit of configuration capabilities to customize your use of an Azure function. So this learning path is now over. We've taken a look at an Azure function where it fits in line with, whether it be the app service plans, which we saw in another recording where we took a look at the types of apps that you could look at: web apps, logic apps, function apps. There's a number of them that you can work with that all exist in the platform as a service model of PaaS. Or you can have an Azure function, which could exist as part of an app service plan or exist in a different service plan unto itself. It doesn't need to be part of an app service plan. And you saw that there was a variety of these plans that makes it very economical to take an Azure function and that limited feature of initiating, triggering activity and being able to perform some actions. And you saw in a previous recording where I talked about using something like the LUN algorithm as a way to add functionality to your application without actually having to write that code into your application. So with that, I encourage you to explore Azure Functions as a way to very efficiently and effectively deploy code as part of your overall application design in a microservice model. Thanks for joining me in this recording. I look forward to seeing you in another one.